we are very happy to have these distinguished guests here today in the last event of the year of the Compliance and Investigation Committee. Thank you a lot. Thank you, Daniel and Jackson, for putting this great team together. I'm sure this will be a very good debate. Just a few words for the members of the committee, and I will switch to Portuguese right now, just very quickly. Essa semana teremos o seminário de concorrência e arbitragem no dia 26, informações no site do IBRAC, e em dezembro, nos dias 1, 3, 7 e 8, teremos o seminário de regulação e concorrência, também espalhado ao longo desses dias, também informações ali no site. Então, contamos com a presença de todos esses eventos do IBRAC. So, now I know that everyone is excited to hear our foreign friends, and I will ask Daniel and Jackson to begin the show. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ribas. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Daniel Rebello. I'm a partner at Pinheiro Neto Advogados in the compliance and the antitrust practices. I'm very happy that we gather such great speakers today, and I'm certain that this is a topic that will have a great impact in our daily practice, and our speakers will help us navigate through these times and what to expect in the next 4 years. I would like to thank IBRAC as well for the opportunity and all the assistance in the organization, and I thank Ribas for everything here. I will also like to thank our guests for their time. Today, we are very proud to have Geert Aalbers, who probably most of you already know. Geert is a partner at Control Risks and heads the Brazil business. He has over 20 years of experience in working in Latin America, and I can honestly say that Geert understands Brazil as few Brazilians do. I'm sure that he has a lot to tell us about the impact of the US elections, trends on enforcement, and also what to expect in the relationship between Bolsonaro and Biden. Thanks for being here, and thanks for your time, Geert. Our second speaker will bring to the panel the experience of a former US prosecutor. John Kolodner is a partner at Cleary. His practice focuses on white-collar criminal enforcement and regulatory matters. Before joining Cleary, John was a prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney Office for the Southern District of New York from 2000 to 2012. So he has more than 10 years of experience as a prosecutor. He was there during the transitions from Clinton to Bush, Bush from Obama. So he knows what he's talking about, and it will be great hearing from him what to expect next in terms of enforcement, cooperation between the authorities, as well as the weight that the new administration will likely give to compliance programs and the relationship with Brazil. John, great pleasure having you here. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
I will now hand over to my colleague Jackson, who will introduce our next guest.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this exciting event. My name is Jackson Ferreira, and I am a member of the Compliance and Investigations Committee of IBRAC. I'm also a senior associate with the Antitrust and Investigations Group of TozziniFreire Advogados in São Paulo, and I recently had the honor to work as an international lawyer at Cleary Gottlieb in New York City with two of our panelists, Lisa Vicens and Jonathan Kolodner. I received my Bachelor of Law degree from the University of São Paulo and my Master's degree from the University of Chicago Law School. I am pleased to introduce Lisa Vicens, who is also a partner at Cleary Gottlieb in New York City and a lawyer of great renown in the compliance, enforcement, and investigations field in the United States and Latin America. Lisa completed her undergraduate and master's studies at Georgetown University and received her Juris Doctor degree from the New York University. Thank you very much for joining us, Lisa. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Jackson.
I am also delighted to introduce Jonathan Wood, who is Control Risk's lead analyst for the United States and Canada, and Deputy Global Research Director, who provides risk analysis and consultancy to multinational organizations in a wide range of industries. Jonathan completed his undergraduate studies at Harvard University and received his master's degree in global politics from the London School of Economics. We're so glad to have you here, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, dear audience, with such a distinguished panel, this will be a unique opportunity to ask questions. Please feel free to pose your questions or comments at any time using the chat box. We'll leave some minutes at the end to address as many questions as time permits. Daniel, I think we're off to start the discussion, shall we?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Jackson. So let's start with Jonathan Wood. Jonathan, I think that you're in a very good position to give us the broad picture here in terms of what's going on right now. When can we expect the discussions on who won the election to be over? And also your views on not only on the relationship between Bolsonaro and Biden. We know that Trump and Bolsonaro were best pals. So what should we expect now? And who is likely to become the next Attorney General? What is his or her profile? What impacts this may happen? We may see in the enforcement focus of the authority.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel and Jackson, and it's a pleasure to be here. Let's just talk a little bit about where we are, what the state of play is in what has proven to be a very drawn-out US election process. We remain in what we might think of as a contested election, which is to say that President Trump has not conceded the election. His campaign continues to mount legal challenges in a number of states, as well as petition for recounts of the vote in both Wisconsin and Georgia for now, and potentially other states down the line. And so this is a political process and an electoral process that continues. It is depriving both the US political system and the international community of some certainty in the process. But at the same time, the result of the election is increasingly clear and will become increasingly clear over the next week to 10 days. We've had the certification of results in Georgia State, one of the key swing states. Today, Monday, we will have a certification in Michigan, most likely, although there is a political challenge there as well. We will have the finalization of county level or local level results in Pennsylvania. So over the coming week, we will begin to have the sort of official parameters of this election fall into place. And this will make some of those pathways for contestation of the result less and less plausible over time. We don't expect a, let's say, friendly transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. If anything, perhaps quite the opposite. What we've seen in terms of both foreign policy and domestic policy over the last few weeks since the election, what we expect to see more of over the next 2 months until the inauguration is a situation in which the outgoing administration really tries to make it difficult for the incoming administration to pursue its priorities. I will say one more thing about the political system for those of you who I think we've perhaps all become somewhat closer observers of US politics over the last few weeks. But as you may know, there are 2 outstanding US Senate races. So this is the upper house of the legislature that are going to take place in Georgia State on the 5th of January. And I mention that because the US Congress and the US Senate is very closely divided. And when we think about what a prospective Biden administration might be able to do, its objectives, its priorities, the policies that it might be able to pursue, including with respect to environmental regulation, climate change, and the US relationship with Brazil, a lot of that will depend on control of Congress. And control of Congress at this point will hinge on these 2 races in Georgia. So even if we do have, over the next few weeks, a clarification of the presidential election result, which is to say, enough states certify the results, President Trump's campaign legal challenges and political challenges continue to falter, and there's no longer much doubt about who will be the next president, we will still have for another month and a half or so some ambiguity or uncertainty about who will control the Congress. And that will certainly set the tone for what a Biden administration will be able to do. So unfortunately, this US election season isn't going to be quite over yet, but certainly will continue to provide lots of interesting political developments over the next few weeks and months. Now, in terms of what this portends for US foreign policy, for US-Brazil relations, and for enforcement and compliance internationally, it's safe to say, and this has been articulated by Biden for more than a year through the campaign and more recently since the election, that his objective is to return the US to a more familiar, more conventional form of foreign policy in key areas. And I think we're beginning to see this with some of the appointments, cabinet appointments that have been announced, or at least rumored, notably Tony Blinken, Biden's very close advisor, as potential Secretary of State. These are appointments that suggest that the incoming Biden administration will indeed pursue a foreign policy that is both more conventional, but also very much more multilateral, in which partnerships and alliances take very high priority in how the US wants to exercise and indeed improve its global influence after 4 years of pretty unilateral and coercive action by the Trump administration. Now, within that sort of framework of rehabilitating US foreign policy, strengthening alliances and partnerships, working through multilateral organizations and institutions, this is where some of the key aspects of the US-Brazil relationship will become really important, because one of the pillars of Biden's foreign and domestic policy will be environmental regulation, will be climate change. Biden and his team have outlined, of course, very ambitious, you might even consider them aggressive environmental policies that are not just about undoing what the Trump administration has spent the last 4 years doing in terms of deregulation of the US environment, but also burnishing and sort of restoring the US's international leadership on environmental and climate issues. Biden has said that on the first day of his administration, he would rejoin the Paris Climate Change Agreement. The US withdrew from that agreement on the 4th of November, so the day after the election, about 3.5 years after Trump had announced the withdrawal. So Biden plans to rejoin that agreement and use it as a platform for improving relationships with some of the key US allies globally, especially the Europeans, who have been quite disappointed in US policy in this area for a number of years, but also US allies and partners in East Asia, and US economic and security partners in other parts of the emerging and developing world where climate change is a very significant issue. So this objective of a more conventional multilateral foreign policy to some degree hinges on what the Biden administration wants to pursue in the environmental domain. And the US wants to the administration will want to set an example both at home, but also abroad in this area. And this is where we have already seen some sparks begin to fly between Biden and President Bolsonaro over this change, this perspective change in US environmental and climate change policy. And not just what the US is going to do at home, but how the US might begin to pressure its trade partners, its allies to align with that as well. And I'll make two comments, I think, on this in terms of how it might play out over the next 12 months. The first is, at a high level, the Biden administration has outlined some policies that it might intend to pursue, which could have a direct implication for Brazil. One of these is, of course, it's contemplated, or it has at least discussed, this concept of placing a tariff on the carbon content of imports to incentivize US trade partners, of which Brazil and the US have a very substantial trade relationship, and the US is, I believe, Brazil's second largest trade partner. to incentivize US trade partners to strengthen their own commitments in this area and begin to decarbonize their economies more rapidly. That's a bit more of an extreme policy, and it's not clear if that is something that will gain much traction from the US Congress, especially one that is very closely divided, or indeed if the Senate remains controlled by the Republican Party. The second area, if that's one of the sort of sticks that the US might wield against trade partners and allies, one of the carrots, and certainly the main approach of the Biden administration's foreign policy, is very much incentive-based. It wants to make very large investments in innovation through government procurement in a more climate-friendly economy, and especially one that, what they think of as a green recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and recession. And it might put restrictions on participation or procurement that are both Buy American, but also environmental in scope. So we do see both of those sides, both the carrot of incentives, but the stick of mandates and regulation is coming to bear in the administration, and especially as it begins to develop its trade policy. But anything that we might see on this front in terms of its aggressiveness is going to absolutely be tempered by the fact that, especially in 2021, this administration's first priorities are really going to be domestic. They're going to be around getting a surging COVID-19 pandemic under control, which is really the immediate and most urgent policy objective of the incoming administration. And so secondary and subsidiary to that will be facilitating an economic recovery from what has been the most significant downturn, certainly since the 2008-2009 crisis, the last time Biden was in the White House, but probably in US terms, even longer than that. And this focus on the domestic in 2021 means that, in our view, it means that there will be really two main implications. The first is some downplaying of foreign policy issues in order to create space to focus on the domestic issues. And secondly, the Democrats have already said that they're not really going to look to dramatically reopen trade policy while they're focusing on domestic economic issues. And so in the next year, I'm not sure that we would see either much progress or much regress in bilateral trade relations, including with Brazil, but also with the wider region. So in a sense, probably the most likely scenario is relative stability, a greater focus and emphasis on things like the environment and climate change and perhaps human rights in bilateral relations, but more broadly an effort to keep any irritants or any issues in international relations from distracting from and precluding the domestic recovery process. That's really going to be the initial emphasis. Now, in terms of what this environment might look like from an enforcement perspective, and bearing in mind that I have some extremely able colleagues on the panel as well, I will just say that I think there is a clear desire to turn the page on what many of Biden's advisors see as a coercive and unilateral exercise of some of these authorities that hasn't really been effective when you look at countries that are under, for example, very significant sanctions pressure, like Iran, where the tactical pressure has absolutely worked, but the strategic objective of limiting its nuclear program has really not. And so I suspect there would be a more judicious exercise, and perhaps a more cooperative one as well, of some of these types of cross-border enforcement mechanisms, whether those are export controls that have wound up impacting countries and companies that are close US partners and allies, sanctions that have far-reaching implications for financial transactions. I do think that the Biden administration, in order to make those tools both more effective, but also bring them more into alignment with US strategy, would take a less unilateral approach and a more multilateral approach in terms of negotiating with and discussing these policies with partners. They've certainly said as much. They're not going to squander the leverage that the outgoing Trump administration has built up in some of these areas. But I think going forward, we might be looking at an enforcement environment that is, at least for business, somewhat less capricious, somewhat more predictable, more bureaucratic, and perhaps more stable as well.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Jackson, I know that you have some questions for Lisa, right?
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Jonathan. It's insightful to approach these kinds of issues from the political risk perspective and also from a broader perspective that you provided. Thank you so much. Now, to potentially complement and build up on Jonathan Wood's views, I would like to turn to Lisa for the perspective of a U.S. enforcement lawyer. Lisa, do you expect any changes in the enforcement focus in the U.S. under the new administration? Relatedly, as a regional expert, how may the change of the U.S. administration potentially impact investigations and compliance in Brazil? And finally, do you see any pressure from the U.S. towards, for example, the continuation of the Lava Jato task force?
So thank you, Jackson. And I agree, that was very helpful to get Jonathan's perspective. If we have time at the end, I want to ask him a lot of questions just to make sure that we are going to have an end to this electoral process and he can all give us a lot of reassurance about that. So the short answer to your question, Jackson, is definitely, I think, yes. We do expect to see changes in the enforcement focus in the United States under a new Biden administration. I think some of these changes are going to reflect a complete shift in priorities. So, for example, as Jonathan mentioned, I think a complete shift toward climate change, which was something completely absent in the last administration, or a shift away as much from immigration. And some of it will be just, I think, a greater focus on policies that were not as much of a focus under the Trump administration. So, for example, a greater focus on financial fraud and a greater focus on consumer protection. I want to talk about this in two ways, as you mentioned, Jackson. First, domestically, I thought I could talk a little bit about the what we see as being the enforcement priorities and what's going to happen. In particular, from the perspective of the SEC, I'll talk about it generally, but I was going to focus my remarks on the SEC since, as you mentioned at the outset, Daniel, we have John here, who's as a former prosecutor, will be able to give you a very inside view of what's going to happen in the DOJ. And then second, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the impact regionally in Latin America, and then more specifically Brazil, and what we see to be a Biden administration's focus from an enforcement perspective in Brazil. So in terms of the SEC, there will be a new chair who will be nominated by President-elect Biden. In the interim, between when his appointee is actually confirmed, the Republican commissioner, Hester Pierce, is going to be acting as the interim chair for the next few months. And, really what we would say is, and kind of going back to what Jonathan said, what we see as being the composition of really both the SEC chair as well as the other members of the commission is going to be dictated a little bit by how much of a mandate Biden has from the House and the Senate. It seems as though it's going to be at a minimum very, very close. If not, he doesn't have a majority in the Senate. And what that means is that it's going to have to be the people he'll pick have to be people who are going to be not extreme. It's going to be difficult, for example, to put in Elizabeth Warren or someone who's going to be seen as very much to the left. It's going to have to be someone who's more going to be a compromised choice with the Senate and with the House. And the remaining commissioners, after the appointment and the confirmation of the chair, it's going to be on a rolling basis as the current commissioners' 5-year terms end. And so we're going to see that happening throughout his term. Now, in terms of the enforcement division, historically, the head of the enforcement division tends to be someone who is close to and selected by the SEC chair. They really worked as a partnership and in tandem. And so the idea is that the SEC chair is allowed to bring in someone who he trusts, a trusted advisor, that they can work together to try to really put into place the SEC's goals and priorities. And otherwise, really what you see at the SEC, and this I think is very similar to Brazil, and what you see in Brazil is you see a lot of career, division staff attorneys just being, continuing in their role and being career employees who stay in place. And that kind of brings me to the next point, which is, what do we expect to see in terms of a change? I mean, I think largely, it's not going to be a dramatic overnight change. And, really, in fact, because these are career staff attorneys, and because, quite frankly, the SEC's investigations typically take up to 2 years, what you're going to see is a lot of continuation of existing investigations. And those are going to occur over the next year to year and a half, where you have investigations that were opened under a Trump administration continuing. And we don't expect to see, and historically, we haven't really seen in the United States that a change in administration means a stop to existing investigations, or that things don't just continue to move forward. I think that, in terms of areas of focus that you might start to see immediately, I think, for the Biden administration, a lot of that's going to really be something that's dictated by external forces. And I say that because we're in the middle of a pandemic. And it's interesting for President-elect Biden in particular, when he became vice president, it was right as the world financial crisis had just started. And he came in, along with President Obama, having to deal with this global financial crisis that was basically, placed on their lap. And he's coming in now under a much different crisis, but in some ways, there's a lot of similarities, right? You have, whereas with the last financial crisis, you came in and there was this big incentive to try to, identify the wrongdoers and figure out how to make sure that, we, from an enforcement perspective, this never occurred again. It was in the context of a really volatile market, and it was in the context of trying to get things back functioning. And I think a lot of that is going to be the same. President-elect Biden is going to be coming in, and I think one of his principal focuses is going to be looking at companies' year-end financials and looking at this volatile market and figuring out a way to protect investors. So he's going to be looking at ensuring that companies are taking the steps to really make sure that they're being candid with investors about the state of their business and the impact of the pandemic on their business. He's going to be looking at things like year-end disclosures and looking at, what are the risk factors that companies are identifying? What are the forward-looking statements that they're making about their company's performance? And he's going to be looking at the accounting judgments that they're making. Did they take appropriate steps in recognizing revenue? Did they properly impair their assets? All of these types of accounting judgments, which are important in the context of a financial crisis, in which he has a great deal of experience with, based on his last, administration under Obama, are going to all be factors that are very, very much at play in the current context under the pandemic. And as the president who is sitting as these first year-end financials come into play. I think similarly, he's going to be looking at identifying people who take advantage of the pandemic and who try to unfairly, basically, trick investors, trick consumers. That's going to be a big focus, and a focus that plays out under the SEC, as well as those who benefit from inside information. And, we've seen this again, just to be fair to the Trump administration, we've seen this already under the Trump administration. A big focus over the last 6 months has been targeting people who are taking advantage of the pandemic, companies that are basically, inside trading on information in the context of this volatile market, including, things like stock buyback plans that companies are putting into place. And so, we see this as being a continuing focus, and if anything, something that's going to just become more targeted under the Biden administration. And I think, in terms of an area that's, I think, interesting in that context for companies, it's really going to be making sure that you have really good financial controls in place and financial reporting processes in place. Another recent area of focus has been non-GAAP financial measures. And I think with all of these, something that is new and that companies really need to be thinking about in this context is what are the steps that they're taking to memorialize the decisions they're making and the judgments they're making, whether it's the use of non-GAAP financial measures, whether it's how they impair their assets. And so for companies, really making sure that you are following your year-end financial reporting processes and taking extra care this year to make sure you memorialize and identify why you're making the judgments that you're making, and the steps that you took to ensure that they were fair and reasonable to investors is going to be really important. So, a couple of other notes from the SEC's perspective that I think are relevant to those attending today. One is the whistleblower program. Under the Trump administration, we've had a really increased use and reliance on whistleblowers by the SEC. I think it's fair to say that is only going to continue and grow under a Biden administration. One thing that's particularly interesting, I think, is that we've seen a real uptick in the number of whistleblower reports that come from people and employees that are outside the United States, so who are working at foreign issuers or who are working at subsidiaries of U.S. companies. And again, I think that that's a trend that we can only expect to see to continue to increase. And another is on sort of going into, I don't want to take too much from Geert's thunder, but I think as we've seen sort of the increased cooperation between countries on FCPA and anti-corruption issues, and as that's become more and more public, as has been sort of the large penalties that are associated with them, I think that we can expect to see that in particular in the area of anti-corruption. So that's one last item. And then I'd say two small other things worth mentioning to this audience from the SEC's perspective is, one, I think financial institutions are going to be an area of focus again under the Trump administration. There'd really been, I'd say, more of a focus on Main Street versus Wall Street. I think that we're going to see a shift toward financial institution enforcement. And that's going to matter for banks, because I think, when banks are looking at their lending or looking at the decisions they're taking abroad, knowing that they're sort of the subject of increased scrutiny, it's going to impact sort of capital markets and really the way that banks interact with companies abroad. So shifting to Brazil and to Latin America, I think a lot of what I wanted to say, is really complementary to what Jonathan already spoke about, which is that I think that, what we're going to see overall under a Biden administration, which is, I think, different from a Trump administration, is a lot more dialogue and a lot more predictability. And I think that, that is really, more than anything, it's a shift in the tone, which I think is going to be really important. I mean, as a student of Latin American studies, we often talk about the Monroe Doctrine and the attitude that the United States can have towards Latin America. And I think that that's something that, unfortunately, we've seen to be really a fundamental part of a Trump administration approach to the region. And I think that we can definitely expect that to change under President-elect Biden. And I think that it's a shift that I think is going to be something that is apparent, even if, as Jonathan said, he may not have the mandate to push forward his agenda as much as he wants through Congress. I think that very much from a foreign policy and a diplomatic perspective, you are going to see that shift in tone, and that is going to be making a difference. In terms of his agenda, I mean, I feel like for Trump, the agenda that he followed in Latin America was pretty narrow. He was very focused on anti-immigration. He was very much focused on, responses to leftist regimes in Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua. And I think that what you're going to see is really a shift in focus under Biden, more towards climate change, as Jonathan said. But I think also really more of a cooperation on enforcement goals like promotion of democracy and anti-corruption. One thing, I feel like 4 years ago when we were talking about what is the change to a Trump administration, everyone talked about how President Trump, talked about the FCPA as being this horrible law, and he wasn't going to enforce FCPA at all. And we're going to see just this complete shift away from anti-corruption enforcement in the United States. And that really didn't come to bear. And, I think a lot of that has to do with what we've talked about, which is that, you have these same career prosecutors and career staff attorneys at the SEC who are continuing their investigations. But I think part of it is also just a lot of what was set in motion by Brazil and by, regional counterparts and the greater cooperation that you saw between authorities in the US and other countries. And, I think if anything, what we're going to see under President-elect Biden is just a greater focus on this. It never went away under President Trump, but what we are going to see is it's going to actually increase and become a greater focus of President-elect Biden. And I think that that's going to be an interesting shift to see, as Jackson mentioned, in light of what we might call shifting priorities in Brazil. And again, I don't want to, I know that Geert's going to talk about this a lot, and I'm probably going to be a lot rosier than Geert because I just tend to be a lot rosier than Geert on most things. But one thing that I would say is that, I agree that the Lava Jato task force is under complete pressure from Jair Bolsonaro. You've seen the teeth pulled from it to a great extent. But I do think that kind of similar to what we've been talking about in the United States, and I'd be interested to hear Geert's views on this. I think that there are some things that you can't undo. So one of them is the professionalization of the federal police and prosecutors in Brazil, who now have all of these investigative techniques that they didn't use before, the sort of bag of tools to investigate and prosecute corruption in Brazil. And I think another item that we have that you didn't have before is this really, really deep connections between the US authorities and the Brazilian authorities, and the greater cooperation that you see between both countries on prosecuting corruption. And quite frankly, what we've seen is the fruits of that, again, very cynically, in terms of these very large resolutions that have brought a lot of, have been advantageous to Brazil, quite frankly. And so I think that, all of that is to say that maybe you won't have a Lava Jato task force, but you will have this continuing cooperation on open and ongoing investigations. And you will have, I think, what we'll see as being common interests in continuing that cooperation, as well as a push from President-elect Biden on Bolsonaro and on Brazil to continue to promote democracy and to combat corruption in Brazil. And I don't think I don't think that is going to change. So a couple of final items that I think might be interesting with respect to Brazil, and aren't really enforcement, but I think kind of go hand in glove with both what Jonathan was saying, and I think impact sort of an enforcement, the sort of relationship we're going to see from an enforcement perspective between Brazil and the US. One is China. So I think, it's interesting. Anybody who's been practicing in Brazil has, over the last 4 years, seen, while Trump's focus has been on immigration, while Trump's focus has been on Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua, one thing his focus hasn't been on has been on the inroads that China has been making in Brazil, in terms of both diplomacy and in terms of trade and in terms of its investment in Brazil and in the region. I think President-elect Biden is going to be very much focused on that. And I think that's partly going to be what drives the greater dialogue and greater diplomacy that he's going to show in Brazil and in the region. And another is on this response to these leftist regimes. I think the US did have a very unilateral approach. And I think that it did have a very harsh approach in dealing with these regimes. And while I don't think that we're going to see under President-elect like a rollback of sanctions or him embracing Cuba in the way that Trump told every Cuban in Miami that he would, I do think that what you are going to see is much more of a multilateral focus and a multilateral effort, which again is going to mean reaching out to Brazil, figuring out how to have this dialogue and figuring out how to work out what are common objectives in the region.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It was super helpful. I think it will be interesting to see maybe a little bit of a more muscular enforcement approach from the new administration, at least through some regulatory agencies. And in times of pandemics, as you mentioned, it may be particularly relevant to welcome a greater focus on financial crimes and consumer fraud, and perhaps a more stringent scrutiny of investors and disclosures. Now, regarding Brazil, international collaboration may continue to be of great importance, and particularly the cooperation with the United States, as you mentioned. Now, how Bolsonaro will align with Biden looks decisive in that sense and is yet to be seen. I think Daniel will move now to ask a question to Jonathan.
Yes, thanks, Jackson. And indeed, Lisa, that was very, very helpful. I think that I fully agree, and I have tons of questions here and issues to discuss. I will first hear from John, the DOJ perspective on these as well. And John, maybe you can share with us also if you see that, having a robust compliance program, having, like Lisa said, all the transparency that the time requests companies to have will get more attention from the DOJ, will able companies to get more credits for their compliance programs. How do you see the next, posture of the DOJ? And I don't know if you have a name, if you know who are the potential attorney generals, but it would be good to know also from you how you see that, the profile and the transition, especially as Lisa said, with the technical staff will probably be the same, but do you see that any hard change in the drive of the DOJ?
He wants the names, John.
Yeah, I wish I had the names. be a popular man if I did. I think first of all, it's been great just to listen to Jonathan and Lisa talk about these issues. I don't think it should be surprising that we should expect quite a bit of change from the Department of Justice over the coming months. That change though is going to take time, in part because Daniel, as you mentioned, there still is a lot of uncertainty about who the nominees will be for the various positions that are open. I really do wish I knew. I mean, I can tell you what I've read in the paper as to who the likely nominees would be. I will say that given the names that have been mentioned in the paper, and that includes, I think, Sally Yates, who was formerly the Deputy Attorney General and the Acting Attorney General before she was fired by President Trump when she refused to enforce his immigration ban on certain Muslim majority countries. Doug Jones, who is a former senator in Alabama, recently lost his reelection campaign and was a former U.S. attorney in Alabama, which is actually kind of interesting given that the first attorney general from the Trump administration was from Alabama, Jeff Sessions. Strange that they would both come from Alabama, which is obviously a small state. I'm not sure who the other names are, but there's, generally speaking, they have been people who have experience that come from the Obama administration, and I think it's been talked about by others on this video so far. The idea is that they would return to sort of the policies and practices more like what the Obama administration was doing, and make a break from the Trump administration. I mean, I think one thing that I think is just worth emphasizing at those, even if those individuals are confirmed, those changes take time. I mean, it's been said that I think that personnel is policy, and obviously if you make those high-level changes, you're likely to change policies. And those policies are likely to move towards the priorities that are associated with Democratic administrations. But I think it's fair to say the Department of Justice, and I've experienced this firsthand, is a huge, huge agency. It has 9,500 attorneys. That would make it actually the largest law firm in the world when you think about that. And those attorneys are spread out among many offices. There's Main Justice in Washington. There are 93 U.S. attorneys' offices, and there are various regional offices. And all those offices have the responsibility for prosecuting crime on a local level. And it can take time, I think, to move an organization that's that large. There are a number of appointees, obviously, that the president will get to make, not just the attorney general. He will also get to make the deputy attorney general, who is sort of like the chief operating officer of the Department of Justice, the associate attorney general, who oversees the antitrust division and the civil division, and then the Assistant Attorney General who supervises the criminal division, and also appoint all of the 93 U.S. attorneys in each of the various districts, including the office that I worked in, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. So that does give President-elect Biden a lot of opportunity to shape the overall leadership of the department and the individuals who are going to oversee enforcement over the next four years. Daniel, as you mentioned, I did go through 2 transition periods, very different ones than this one is likely to be, from the one from Clinton to Bush in 2000, when I just started at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and then the one in 2008 from Bush to Obama. And I did see, obviously, the 2016 transition from outside of the department. And having lived in that sort of period, I can, I know, having been there, that there's a lot of uncertainty within the department right now, not knowing whether the people that I mentioned or others are going to be nominated by the Biden administration. And there are, quite a bit of open seats right now within the administration, people who have left appointed positions, and there are acting people who are serving in an acting capacity in their place. So, for example, the Assistant Attorney General from the Criminal Division was a man named Brian Benchkowski, who returned to private practice earlier this year, and there's a non-presidentially appointed person named Brian Rabbit who's in his place. There are other examples of this as well, including my old office, which has an acting U.S. attorney. Now, Bill Barr is still the Attorney General, and the Deputy Attorney General is also presidentially appointed. So, they may make efforts, and there's been reports about Trump administration appointees trying to lock in those Trump policies, so make it really hard for Biden to change those policies. But we haven't heard a lot of that on the Department of Justice side of things so far. And I think generally speaking, people serving in an acting capacity are less likely to want to make significant policy changes leading up to change in administration. But this has also been said by I think both Jonathan and Lisa, and very similar to what Lisa said with respect to the SEC. Having watched these changes on the inside, I can also say that while it's a challenging time, I think the day-to-day work of the department is going to continue. And the individual cases are led by career prosecutors.
John, as Jonathan said, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Jonathan said that these may not be the easiest transition in the government in terms of communication. Do you see the same issue with the DOJ in terms of communication? And also, as I think that Lisa mentioned this, that during these last 4 years, the DOJ established great connections with prosecutors in Brazil. In your experience, in your transitions, did they hand over these connections and these communications, or do you see any need for them to build up this this network again?
Well, a lot of those connections are, I think, held by career prosecutors, people who have been serving in the department for many years. And if you look at, for example, a lot of the connections, just to take the corruption side of things, on in FCPA investigations or through the fraud section of the Department of Justice and the FCPA unit. Those individuals are not presidentially appointed supervisors. They're line prosecutors who worked their way up and became supervisors typically. And those individuals will continue in their current roles, at least in the short term. And to the extent that they have built relationships, those relationships are likely to continue. Now, to the extent the relationships are held by more senior members within the department, then I agree with you. Those relationships will have to be rebuilt. Now, if you start with somebody like Sally Yates as the Attorney General, she's likely to have some of those relationships already, having served as the Deputy Attorney General in the prior Democratic administration, the Obama administration. So, I think that those relationships will continue. I think the Biden administration is going to be the kind of administration, given their focus on improving the United States standing within the world. They're more likely to want to grow those relationships, and they're going to be particularly interested in doing so, I think, on the corruption side of things as well. So, I think another thing that we were talking about was what the priorities for the new department will be in the new leadership. And I can actually give a few examples from when I was the U.S. attorney, or assistant U.S. attorney, and in the U.S. attorney's office, back last decade. And in the transition from just even a new U.S. attorney was appointed in 2005. The new U.S. attorney was named Michael Garcia in 2005, and he shifted resources from what had been sort of a push to prosecute accounting fraud. And you might remember like the WorldCom prosecution and Enron, and shift to public corruption. And what he did was he changed the leadership of the public corruption unit, and he added additional prosecutors to handle those cases. And that resulted in, takes time, but it resulted in a number of additional public corruption cases that were brought in the New York area, including of the governor, Eliot Spitzer, who you might remember had a huge scandal in which he was prosecuted. Another example is in 2009 when Preet Bharara became the U.S. attorney, and he's well known for this insider trading push, but that was not something that had been as much of a focus of the prior leadership of the office. I mean, something that, of course, is always a focus of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan, but Preet added additional prosecutors and really made it a focus of his administration, and that led to a number of insider trading prosecutions in my old office. I think they ended up prosecuting over 100 people for insider trading. So changes in leadership leads to changes in certainly priorities, and the leadership has the ability to do this by restructuring how the Department of Justice operates, either at a macro level or on an office by office basis. They have the ability to move prosecutors to different kinds of cases, investigative agents from the FBI, create new FBI squads, for example. And over time, they'll have the ability to replace some of these non-political appointees, the people who may have the relationships in Brazil, for example. That will also have an impact on priorities. I'm happy to talk a little bit also, Daniel, about some of the priorities that I see. And I think this is largely consistent with what Jonathan and Lisa have said. I mean, I think we should really expect in a democratic administration more aggressive enforcement of financial and corporate crimes. I think Lisa said this as well, but certainly we've seen a shift in resources to violent crime and immigration offenses. But if you look back at what the Obama administration did, I think we can expect more of a return to that and the high levels of corporate investigations and corporate fines. I would expect FCPA and money laundering to continue to be an area of enforcement. I don't think we should see much of a change in that. And I think Lisa mentioned this too, but the Department of Justice, like the SEC, has brought a number of FCPA cases, a growing number over the last 4 years. And I think we were all had concern that wouldn't be the case. And it's really hard to imagine the Biden administration shifting direction on that. I think some of this has already been mentioned, focusing on China, focusing on technology. I think another significant area of enforcement will be offenses coming out of the pandemic. It's really crazy in some ways when you think about it, that $2 trillion was distributed as part of the CARES Act, including $500 billion to companies. And, there's going to be a number of investigations. It's really hard to imagine that there wouldn't be, of how all that money was used. I think as Lisa mentioned too, with all the market volatility and companies suffering, there's an increasing likelihood of accounting fraud. And I think the Department of Justice, and particularly my old office, the Southern District of New York, is likely to be interested in that. Finally, I think there's going to be focus on environmental and climate prosecutions. Biden has promised during the campaign to actually create a new division within the Department of Justice called the Environmental and Climate Justice Division. We'll see if that actually happens or not, but certainly that suggests the focus that the administration and the Department of Justice will have on that. And I think we can also expect to see increased antitrust enforcement. I know we haven't talked a lot about that, but certainly criminal antitrust enforcement has gone down relatively over the last few years. Part of that may just be more generally, I think that's a trend we've seen elsewhere around the world. Fewer criminal cartel cases, but I think that I would certainly expect anyway an increased focus on that in the new administration. I want to go back to your question at the beginning about how the department is likely to consider cooperation credit, compliance programs, and individual, how companies are providing information about individual bad actors as well. And just very briefly, the prosecution of companies is governed by a Department of Justice policy, the principles of prosecution of business organizations, and over just to give you a little bit of background, I think over time, those principles have given prosecutors guidance on whether or not to charge a company, what kind of resolution there should be, and how what penalty a company should pay. And obviously one significant part of that is, Daniel, as you pointed out, is the level of cooperation credit that a company should get, whether it's because it has a strong compliance program or because it's the company has provided information about individuals. This is something I think that is particularly true and important for FCPA cases. In the beginning with the Obama administration, I think there was a push by the Department of Justice to put in place policies that ensured more transparency with respect to the benefits for self-reporting, cooperation, having a strong compliance program. And that's ultimately resulted in the corporate enforcement policy, which probably many of you know about. Just in case you don't, in short, if you self-report wrongdoing, that includes FCPA violations, and you fully cooperate and remediate as a company, and there are no aggravating factors like pervasiveness of the misconduct or executive involvement, or a company that's a recidivist, company can receive a declination from the Department of Justice and just will have to pay restitution or disgorgement of any benefits that it got. Even if there are aggravating factors, a company is entitled to 50% off the penalty, and if you don't self-report, you can get a maximum of 25% off the penalty. All of this, though, is contingent on both cooperating and remediating. That includes having a strong compliance program. The question is really, I think, how will the Department of Justice and the Biden administration view these factors? Well, how will it view cooperation? How will it view providing information on individuals? How will it view compliance programs, and whether that will change? And I think for some of the same reasons we've been talking about, how on a day-to-day basis the operations of the department, or the SEC for that matter, aren't going to change significantly in the short term. While I would certainly expect Biden administration appointees to closely scrutinize cooperation, whether a company is cooperating, whether it has a strong compliance program, I'm not sure, like in the short term, at least, there'll be a material difference in how they assess that. The line prosecutors and the supervisors who are going to be making those decisions are really the same people who've made it in the Trump administration, who to some extent would have been making it in the Biden administration. And these policies, I think, are fairly clear. They go back all the way to the Obama administration with the Yates memo, for example, which talked about the importance of focusing on individual prosecutions. I mean, I would expect, just as a final point, that the appointees in the Biden administration and senior level DOJ personnel who are appointed by those individuals, would generally be less solicitous of corporate arguments, whether a company was involved in wrongdoing, perhaps be more inclined to impose more significant penalties on companies. But it'll take time for those individuals to have an impact and to get involved, and they have to get confirmed for all the reasons that we've talked about. That's going to be a slow process.
Thanks, John. Well, I think that we'll have a lot of work. If everything happens, we'll definitely have a lot of work. And well, it's good. John, one quick question for you before we move to Geert. Do you see that the lack of alignment between the Brazilian government and the US government may have an impact on the DOJ as well, in terms of focusing on Brazilian companies, or putting pressure on Brazilian issues? Or is the DOJ neutral in that sense?
Well, I guess a few things. First, I think a lot of the cases that the Department of Justice has been bringing have been driven in part by these new policies, which I think encourage companies, including Brazilian companies, to consider self-reporting these if they've identified wrongdoing. Now, a lot of the cases that have come from Brazil have actually stemmed in part from investigations that have been conducted by the Brazilian authorities, but ultimately the Department of Justice is they're bringing cases where companies come to them in the first place and raise facts that they've identified in their own internal investigations with the department to get credit. So, I'm not sure that in that sense that there will be a significant impact from the change in administration, and to the extent that there are changes in the relationship between the two governments. I guess maybe I'll paint myself on the more optimistic side, like Lisa. That I don't know if Geert's going to be the least optimistic of all of us here.
I'll do my best not to.
That there will continue to be cooperation between the two governments on investigations. But I guess my point is that the Department of Justice ultimately, when they're investigating companies, is often relying more on the company than on their relationship with the local prosecutors in building their cases and conducting their investigations. That's part of why these policies that they've implemented that encourage self-reporting and cooperation credit are so important.
Thanks, John. Let's see if Geert is optimistic or not. Jackson, you have the questions, the hard questions to Geert.
Of course. So thank you so much, John. It's actually very enriching to have this inside view of how things may change in the new administration. To continue on this note about the expectations for the future, I would like to turn to Geert Aalbers as one of the authors of the 2020 Capacity to Combat Corruption Index report. Geert, last June, Control Risks released the second edition of the Capacity to Combat Corruption Index together with the America Society and Council of the Americas. The purpose of the index and the report is to evaluate and rank countries based on how effectively they can fight corruption. It's interesting that Brazil was ranked 4 out of 15 Latin American countries. Considering the apparently positive result, I would love to hear from you about the expectations for enforcement trends in Brazil moving forward.
All right, thank you. And first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation. Super helpful to hear from our friends at Cleary as well, what they think on the enforcement front. Of course, Jonathan has been giving me an earful of what's happening, what's not happening in the US. So it's nice. It's good to hear the update we're getting kind of on a daily basis. So specifically on the on your question, and given that it's Thanksgiving weekend, I will try to be kind of more aligned and the like with my US friends here. But I think perhaps it's worth just describing for those of you on the call, what the CCC index is, because I think it helps understand where some of our comments are coming from. And I promise not to be too bearish. The Capacity to Combat Corruption Index was as Jackson mentioned, was a joint effort between Control Risks and Council of the Americas. And Council of the Americas, for those unfamiliar, is a kind of a US based think tank promoting social and economic development in Latin America. And the index itself, what we tried to do there was measure how well countries in Latin America are capacitated to fight the problem of corruption through preventing, through detection, enforcement, obviously punishment. And the reason we did that was because as Lava Jato took off in 2014, and we saw several other regulatory investigations throughout the region, including in Guatemala, which is probably the odd reason why it was included in the first report in 2019, we looked at the 7 main economies, or the largest economies in Latin America, plus Guatemala, exactly because Guatemala was going through a bit of its own Lava Jato at the time. The reason we thought it would be interesting to put the index together was because, like many of you who are very intimately familiar with the anti-corruption scene, certainly in Brazil and probably in large parts of Latin America and the Americas more broadly, kind of begged the question why some countries were much more effective, or have been much more effective at combating corruption than others. And Brazil is a case in point, I think, not just for Latin America, but I think globally. It served as an example. So in the 2019 index, Brazil came out quite strong in terms of the score. It was second just after Chile. What we tried to measure, and this is important, I think, for the conversation we're going to have, we looked at the capacity to combat corruption from several different complementary perspectives, because we understood that it was the combination of these, let's say, pillars which enables countries to really combat corruption effectively. We looked at what we call legal capacity or rule of law, and kind of the tools, that are available, expertise that's available, the actual enforcement institutions and their independence, like the judiciary, the anti-corruption office, the prosecutors, the existence of frameworks for leniency and plea bargain and whether they're effectively being used. We also looked at democracy and political institutions, and that sounds a little bit vague, but of course the entire decision-making process around rulemaking is very, very important, both in terms of passing legislation, which is conducive to fighting corruption, as well as in itself the fragmentation. For example, in Brazil, as all of you are aware, with more than 30 parties in Congress, is one of the key reasons why there is so much corruption as well, right? If we add into the mix a lack of, or the absence of lobbying laws, and opaqueness around campaign financing and auditability of those, then I think you kind of start to understand why that part of the pillar, the second pillar there of the index, is so important to analyze when we try to project what might happen in Brazil. And the third pillar, and I think most of you will appreciate the importance of this one, is civil society. So how well mobilized is civil society, specifically in the cause anti-corruption? Media, is media independent, first of all, and the quality of investigative journalism alike in the private sector. So those were the three key pillars. We published the 2020 index, which is the second version of the report, in June of this year. And what we saw, we expanded the index to 15 countries. And what we saw this year, as a general trend, and I will drill down into Brazil, but as a general trend, we saw either countries stagnating, and I can name there Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, which are kind of haven't really moved, since 2019, and maybe not since 2018 or 17 or whatever, but they've kind of stayed the same. And we saw some countries which actually saw significant regression in the score. And Brazil was one of them. Guatemala, Venezuela, and Brazil, I wouldn't want to lump them all together, other than that they all had significant declines in scores, but clearly different reasons. That said, and Jackson, to your point, clearly Brazil was still ranked fourth in 50 out of 15 countries. Number 1, 2, and 3, maybe no surprise, Uruguay, Chile, and Costa Rica. And then, followed by Brazil. So to be, staying a little bit on the optimistic side, the framework, the capacity Brazil has is significantly better than almost the entire region. That's still the case. So before I jump into what's actually happening now and what might be happening in the future, I just want to highlight, let's say, 3 key factors which led to a decline from 2019 to 2020 in the index. One of them was related, and all of you are familiar with this, with the Supreme Court decision, November 2019, to reverse its previous understanding from 2016, essentially barring imprisonment of those convicted in appeal until all legal appeals have been exhausted. This is not the forum, or maybe it is an excellent forum to debate this, but that's not the purpose of the conversation today. So I won't get into the legal merits, but I think suffice to say that the decision itself was taken in quite peculiar circumstances. It was kind of on the, in a highly politicized environment around Vaza Jato and the leakages, of messages between prosecutor and former Judge Moro, shed question marks around his independence and objectivity, over the Lula trials. And secondly, I think there's also, probably in this audience as well, generally broad consensus. Again, whether it's the right or wrong, interpretation of the Constitution is not the discussion here, but I think there's generally broad consensus that the decision itself has a negative impact on prosecuting and enforcing crime in general, including corruption. So that was one of the points. The second factor, I think it was a really important one, was the appointment of the prosecuting general. And we saw that as a sign, appointing a chief prosecutor outside of the traditional shortlist has significant, I would say, implications. The first one was the prosecutor and president himself had mentioned that he wanted to appoint someone who was more aligned with his thinking, which, that already undermines the notion of independence. And the second one is because the prosecutor was nominated outside the shortlist, there's a certain lack of legitimacy amongst the federal prosecutors, right? So the current chief prosecutor derives his power mainly from Bolsonaro, seems to be, rather than from the federal prosecutors at large. And we'll discuss a little bit further why that's important. Furthermore, we had some erosion of, let's say, the independence of prosecutors' independence. We saw, alleged interference there in particularly the state of Rio de Janeiro with some of the investigations by the federal police and also tax authorities into close circles of Bolsonaro's family. And that obviously doesn't help the whole, notion of independence of prosecutors, which is a key element of the index. Then on the democracy and political institution side, I would highlight a decision by the Supreme Court in March 2019, essentially stating that, the crimes related to campaign or political campaigns, which include corruption, money laundering and the like, that they should be tried over by that should preside over by the electoral courts rather than the criminal courts. And as a result, the electoral courts, I think most of you are probably more familiar with them than I am, but they're certainly not cut out to be, experts in prosecuting or in judging, money laundering crimes and corruption and the like. So that was I think another decision which impacted the decline score. And the fourth one was related exactly to the third pillar, civil society and media. And what we saw there was generally lower levels of mobilization, social mobilization against corruption. And we also saw a significantly more hostile environment. I think all of us have witnessed this on TV for journalists in general. So that's what led to June 2020, a decline in Brazil's score, emphasizing still that Brazil is, ranked number 4 in the index, so still relatively well. Looking forward, there are a couple of trends I'd like to highlight, and I'd say there's reason for concern, but not panic. I don't know if that helps placate some of your fears, Lisa, but there's reason for concern, not panic. The first, I think, general trend, and this is not just Brazil, we see this in Mexico, and we see this in Colombia and Peru and some in Chile and in Colombia. There's a certain level of enforcement fatigue. And the importance of that is the following, that certainly now with the pandemic, Jonathan mentioned, the number one item on Biden's agenda is fighting the pandemic and making sure that the country gets back on track from a healthcare point of view and obviously economically as well. This is no different than many other countries in Latin America. And of course, the political differences may not make very clear exactly where Brazil's heading in this regard, but it's fair to say that the economy, jobs, healthcare, social rights, and the like are competing, themes and important ones for the corruption agenda. So corruption, if you go back to 2014, 2015, 2016, when this entire anti-corruption movement started in the region and certainly in Brazil, it was left, right, and center. It was the theme, the topic, and that's no longer the case. It's not that it's not important, but it's not the single most important. The second development, and again, we see this in, I would specifically name Argentina, Peru, Mexico, and Brazil, is the intensifying backlash of the political class against the anti-corruption movement. And this has been a very gradual movement, and it's not something which is unforeseen. I think, there are ample references to other countries where this has happened, mainly in Italy with Mani Puliti and the like, but it's a normal course of history, I would say, that at some point the efforts, anti-corruption efforts, they hit a roadblock, or they, some of the momentum is lost, and that's exactly the time when the political class, certainly a political class which is very much under investigation. If we look at Congress, there's still many investigations open against Congress members, and we see that that's had some implications, which I'll describe, as well as an increased politicization of law enforcement bodies. And we've seen this across the region. We certainly see some of this happening here in Brazil. So what we see in Brazil is that President Bolsonaro obviously is intensifying his efforts to shore up support base in Congress, and the whole, let's say, forging of bridges with Centrão. This is good for governability, because quite frankly, it's impossible to run the country without a broad support in Congress. This is normal politics, but it's also not normal politics in the sense it's back to business as usual, pork barrel politics and handouts of jobs for support. And it's therefore not surprising to see that many of the members who are actually themselves under investigation, that there are many attempts to continue to weaken some of the very institutions and legislative initiatives which have been designed to strengthen the fight against corruption. We saw that with Sergio Moro's package, but currently we also see, for example, the anti-money laundering law, where there are proposals. I'm not saying they will be approved in Congress, but there are clear proposals to dilute the effects of the anti-money laundering law, certainly in its fight against corruption. The administrative probity law, and I think that's one which has a lot of the prosecutors and others very concerned, because that one actually does have quite a broad base support in Congress. Society, generally speaking, civil society doesn't really know what the law represents and what it means. And therefore, it's less under scrutiny than, for example, segunda instancia, right? The constitutional change there, which would again reverse, let's say, or codify the previous understanding of the Supreme Court from 2016, that people can go to jail after being convicted in appeal. Those are really evident pieces of legislation, but the improbity law is not. And it's the impact, however, of approving a relaxation of that law is quite significant for the fight against corruption, particularly in the municipalities and mayors and the like, who are up to no good. So I think that's one to watch. I would just highlight another 2 points which we're looking at, looking forward. One is the composition of the Supreme Court. So Bolsonaro made a surprise appointment to the Supreme Court, a bit of an incognito. No one really, at least I wasn't familiar with it. I don't think many others on the call perhaps were expecting the appointment. And he has one more appointment to make, I think by June or July 2021. The importance obviously is because the Supreme Court has been so important in terms of decision-making for, the direction of the anti-corruption movement in Brazil, but also because the new Supreme Justice Marques has now very recently been incorporated in the second chamber of the Supreme Court. The second chamber, of course, has been traditionally quite opposed to many of the methods of Lava Jato, and again, some for good reasons, others perhaps for not such good reasons, but fact of the matter is that, we may see a majority forming there with 2 other justice ministers. And if the debut vote of Marques is anything to go by, I think it's likely that we'll see that chamber, solidify and consolidate its car wash, certainly, stances. So that's an important one. And then finally, on the task force itself. So I think it's important to note, and I think some people sometimes forget this, that the car wash task force, and it's not the only one, there are Greenfield and there are many others, but all task forces come to an end at some point, right? You can't have task force. The whole purpose of a task force is that it has a very specific purpose, has a budget, expertise and the like, and they're very, very effective, and they've been very, very effectively used in Brazil. So the fact that we're talking and there are discussions around any car wash shouldn't be a reason for panic. The fact, however, that we are only 2 months out before supposedly some type of new model might be put in place, we don't know what that model is. We don't know what that transition might be like. That is somewhat concerning. So there's a question of, whether it's politically motivated or not. There's certainly a problem with planning. And at the same time, we've also seen quite a lot of dissatisfaction amongst prosecutors themselves. Of course, when you take money away and, they've had the limelight for a long time, no one likes that. But there are also pragmatic considerations there. So the attempts to access, and centralize the entire car wash database was by the chief prosecutor, was certainly something which made people and the prosecutors concerned about their constitutional independence and autonomy. And it's created a certain, an environment and where the risk currently is that, a combination of departures. We saw departures in Brasilia and in Sao Paulo, lack of planning, lack of resources, let's put that into the perspective of the pandemic as well. Government finances are under tremendous pressure and cuts need to be made everywhere. So the lack of resources is not necessarily lack of resource only for task forces anti-corruption, it's more broadly, but obviously would impact them. But those really generate significant risk as to what might come in place. And we might see therefore, a loss of know-how and expertise and like on the anti-corruption front, which would be quite problematic. But in summary, and then we can open up for questions, I think the enforcement institutions remain very strong in Brazil. To Lisa's point, I think they're very resilient despite the headwinds. And I think it's important to note as well, we have an ongoing investigation into one of the sons of Bolsonaro, Flávio Bolsonaro, and that continues to move forward. That seems to be quite a robust case, and it will be interesting to see where that ends up. Collaboration instruments are being used. Obviously, some of the excesses have been cut, but I think they will continue to be important tools for investigation. International cooperation, without a doubt, I agree with all the speakers here, that will continue. There's the channels of communication are very, very strong. There's a lot of respect between the institutions, and I can only see that improving. And also, with the benefit of hindsight, if we look at one of the bits of legislation, for example, the abuse of authority law, which is passed in September 2019, that had everyone's, certainly the prosecutors, I think judges were quite concerned about what the implications might be. It could be used as an intimidation tool. But I think so far it's been much less draconian than people have imagined. So as a result, I think that's probably also, a positive sign. Overall, clouds on the horizon, yes. And there are some trends which, if they converge and solidify and continue, will lead to reversal, but we're still quite hopeful that there will be continued enforcement for the years to come.
Thank you so much, Geert. It was really, really helpful and insightful. Actually, as you were speaking, I thought to myself that institutional maturity, as many people say, can't be taken for granted because setbacks are actually real. But what strikes me the most is to think about the opportunism of corruption rearing its head during the pandemic. At the same time, considering how much we have evolved as a country, I want to be, so to speak, cautiously optimistic. And I think that debates such as this one can help raise awareness and keep the fight against corruption alive. Daniel, I think I saw a question pop up in our chat box, if I'm not mistaken. I think it would be for John Kolodner, perhaps, because I remember it popped up that time. It's about Tony West. I think John was mentioning possible candidates for the Department of Justice, and somebody, Thiago Jabor, asked about if it would be Tony West, which I think he was Associate Attorney General in the Obama administration, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's right. He was the Associate Attorney General, and I think he now works at Uber. But he's also a name that's been mentioned, and I think much like Sally Yates, his appointment would, very much be in line with bringing back somebody from the Obama administration who would continue that administration's policies.
Great. So I'm not sure if we would have, we have, I think, 5-6 minutes to finish the event. I don't know, Daniel, if there would be any room for maybe opening for any more questions, or I think there's one. Oh, I think Guilherme Ribas sent a message here, a question. How could Biden engage in the fight against corruption from Latin America's private and public sectors? can he be expected to support regional and country-specific efforts to strengthen judicial systems and the rule of law? What tools could he use to go after corrupt individuals and organizations from abroad? And he gives an example, visa bans, for instance. I don't know if any one of our distinguished panelists would like to address.
Well, I can just make one minor comment here, which is that one of the big trends I think we've seen in US sanctions enforcement and development over the last few years, which certainly accelerated under Obama, but seemed to have continued through the Trump administration, maybe even accelerated further, was using public corruption as a sanctions trigger, especially under global Magnitsky and some of the other related extra jurisdictional or extraterritorial sanctions regimes. And it seems as though the Biden administration would probably continue that trend with these sort of non-territorial sanctions to focus on human rights, public corruption, and probably, in addition, issues related to democracy, elections, and those types of things.
Great, thank you.
So I had a question for Geert that I wanted to pose to him, which is just in terms of the ending of the Lavajato task force, I think it might be helpful to just explain from a nuts and bolts perspective, like what are the tools that a task force has as a task force, that when the task force is disbanded, what does it mean for the prosecutors who are involved in the investigations on the task force?
I think others on the call might be better capacity to answer that call, but obviously the resources, exclusive resource for the particular purpose, and the exclusivity of the dedication of the prosecutors, I think is the main benefit there, which obviously means they don't get distracted by other matters, and you create a center of excellence and knowledge. I think you kind of I think that exactly the fact that there's no distraction to have to focus on other matters is probably the most important one. I don't know, Daniel, whether you have any other specific items you'd put on the list there, but
that's exactly it, Geert. I think that the exclusivity would probably be the most important one. The prosecutors are dealing with one issue, and they have, of course, the Lava Jato is huge. It's not easy to understand, and sometimes it's not easy to connect the dots from one investigation to another. So the fact that they are exclusively working on this matter is definitely something that is very important, and that we'll have to see how it will work. Lisa, I also don't see reason for panic. But we'll see in reality how that will develop, how much focus they will still give to these investigations and enforcement. And it is possible that other task forces are made up to perform different investigations there. So what I was mostly concerned is like something like what happened to the Greenfield task force, that by the end of the day had one prosecutor, and it's nonsense to have a task force of one prosecutor. So we'll have to see how will be the new structure, the new arrangement. But I also see some silver linings and some possibilities of enforcement.
Yeah.
Yes, go on.
No, I was going to say to the, maybe the metaphor we should be using is, the glass not half or half empty or half full. The actual shape of the glass and the size of the glass is changing. So we really don't know.
Absolutely. That's right.
Optimistic or pessimistic.
That's right. That's right. I know that we have to end at 12:30 sharp. Ribas gave us very strict instructions on that. And just before finishing, and I will also pass on to Jackson, but I wanted to thank you all so much. It was great hearing you. I learned a lot, that's for sure. And I think that we had the broad perspective of the US, of course, great indications of what the SEC and the DOJ will do. And then we finished up with Brazil, with Geert. Thanks a lot. It was great having you here, and I hope we have other opportunities to chat about this issue. Jackson?
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Bye-bye. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Thank you.